In the winter of 1947, Harold Bradley, a 69-year-old chemistry professor at the University of Wisconsin, along with several of his sons, skied into the backcountry wilderness of Yosemite National Park, California, where they spent the better part of 2 months. The excursion was the fulfillment of a dream Bradley had nursed for years, perhaps even decades. World War II interrupted his plan, but the end of the war brought the opportunity. Several of his sons had just returned from military service and were not yet embarked on careers. 2 of them were still in school and unmarried. Being dutiful sons and ardent ski enthusiasts, they were easily persuaded to join Bradley on his adventure. Most importantly, Bradley, at 69, still felt physically fit enough for such an undertaking. So this was indeed his big chance, and he grabbed it. The region they would be in lies along the Tioga Road, which crosses the Sierra Nevada from the town of Lee Vining, near Mono Lake on the east, to Yosemite Valley on the west, a road that is open only in summer and early fall. What made this area especially attractive for Bradley, apart from its natural beauty and winter isolation, was that along this road there exist many summer cabins. Bradley had no wish to spend 2 months camping in the snow. Cabins offered comfort, a place to warm up, dry off, cook meals, and sleep. So, in the summer of 1946, Bradley drove west with his wife and one of his sons, seeking to gain permission to use 3 cabins, conveniently spaced apart along the Tioga Road. The first one, privately owned, lay just east of Tioga Pass and Yosemite National Park, a cabin that could be reached in a single day from Lee Vining Canyon, the starting point. The second one was located in Tuolomne Meadows, 10 miles to the west, a cabin belonging to the Sierra Club. The third was a Park Service cabin on the shore of Lake Tenaya, yet another 9 miles to the west. Amazingly, Bradley succeeded in getting permission to use all 3, even though some Park Service rules had to be bent a little bit in the case of the Tenaya cabin. That done, they spent 2 weeks stocking the 3 cabins with food and firewood for the coming winter, then returned to Madison, Wisconsin, for fall semester classes at the university. Come February, Bradley and 3 sons were back in Lee Vining with skis and packs and the keys to the cabins. The film which follows was made by Harold's son Ric, a member of the party, using a Bell & Howell 8.8 movie camera loaned to him by a friend. The film is partly in color, partly in black and white. Color film was still scarce in 1947. Ric narrates this film 55 years after the event, but with memories still vivid and sharp, and nostalgic, for that was indeed a magical winter. We spotted this sign beside the highway just west of Reno, Nevada. Quite an appropriate sign to have on the outskirts of Reno, I should think. Bill and I spent a day limbering up at Sugar Bowl, a ski area near Donner Summit, 40 miles west of Reno. That's Bill. The snow was deep and heavy, quite typical of the Sierra and very different from the snows back home. Brother Bill handles it nicely. Mostly I do just flail turns, linked flail turns. That's hard work. Our skis were long and heavy, typical of that era, 7 feet 3 inches or about 221 centimeters, even so quite a bit shorter than the 8-foot skis my father used the first time he skied in the Sierra, back in 1921. At that time, his single ski pole was the handle of a garden rake. We are now in Levining, on the east side of the Sierra, 100 miles south of Reno, our last outpost. Brother Steve has joined us from Colorado, and he and Bill and Pop are putting final touches on their equipment. We didn't actually ski into Levining, even though this suggests we did. Next day, Steve, our itinerant ham, does a toothbrushing sequence for the camera. We leave the car a few miles up valley at the edge of snow. That's Mono Lake, full of water in 1947. It looks quite different now. Most of the water which used to flow into it has been diverted to Los Angeles. Actually, we have two hams on the trip, Steve and Bill. I think I must have been trying to use up this black and white film so I could get the color. Steve doing some sketching. He was an aspiring and talented artist in those days. That's Pop with a necktie. How many people do you know who ski with a necktie? And that's Bill to the right with Gerald Young. Gerald operates a hydroelectric plant at the foot of Levining Gorge. He and his wife Eunice kindly put us up at their place for 2 nights. Note the spectacular and forbidding eastern escarpment of the Sierra. The car is now under wraps for the winter, and here we start up the valley to the hydroelectric plant. There comes Steve. And Pop skiing with his long undershirt. That white box on Bill's pack, shown in a minute here, there it is, that white box on Bill's pack is fudge. My bride-to-be sent it from Madison, and it arrived in the Levining post office just as we were departing. I can't explain how come Bill has it. We spent a day at the hydroelectric plant riding a homemade ski tow Gerald Young built for their personal use. With all that electricity available, why not? The snow on this south-facing slope was quite nice spring snow in February. Again, note the long skis and the good old Arlberg swing the shoulders technique. A good stem Christie can get you most anywhere. Now we prepare to climb the gorge. Steve straps on the climbing skins. Gerald and Eunice bid us farewell. There's absolutely no significance to that black cat crossing our path. The climb up the gorge was probably no more than a mile in length, but it was steep and rocky and icy. It took us most of the day to reach the top. There comes the Tioga Road, side-hilling up from Levining, but it is choked with ice and fallen rocks, not safe for skiing, which is why we climbed the gorge. We reached Tioga Camp late in the afternoon. The top of the gas pump suggests that the snow is about 6 feet deep, perfect for us. Plenty deep to cover the rocks and brush, but not so deep as to bury our cabin, which sometimes happens. That's our cabin. We put the pole on the roof the previous summer so we could find the cabin if it were buried. Here's Bill testing the face washing facilities. And here he shows how not to enter the front door. An arty shot, typical Sierra snow, very good for snowballs. And this is Rick showing how not to enter the back door. And finally, here's Steve showing how to avoid going through the cabin altogether, an idea he says he got from a Swiss calendar. Of course, one can become overconfident. We spend a day ski touring up the valley toward Mount Conness and Saddlebag Lake, ideal country for ski touring. The snow, however, is a bit wet and heavy, lots of water content, unlike Rocky Mountain powder. This was pretty much our routine for the entire winter, day trips from cozy cabins. It was a beautiful idea whose time had come. Mount Dana in the background there. Generally, Pop arose early and made breakfast. Lunch was a light snack. Then we boys rotated the duty, cooking dinners, trying to outdo each other and making gizzard busters. After a week at Tioga Camp, we pack up and head to our second cabin, 10 miles to the west in Tuolomne Meadows. This is approaching Tioga Pass, the eastern gateway to Yosemite National Park. In the distance is Mammoth Peak, not to be confused with Mammoth Mountain, the famous ski area many miles to the south. The Tioga Road drops 1,500 feet in elevation to Tuolomne Meadows, but spread over 8 miles, the gradient is too gentle to allow much gliding. Most of it was a long slog, mushing through deep snow. Cathedral Peak and the Unicorn in the distance, two of Tuolomne Meadows' signature peaks. The Macaulay Cabin in Tuolomne Meadows lies near a natural soda springs that bubbles away wastefully all winter. On the log enclosure is a sign that says, "This is not a bar. Get your soda water and move on." There's the Macaulay Cabin. Obviously, there was no welcoming committee awaiting us. Next day, while Pop catches up on his journal, Bill and I examined the corn snow on nearby Lembert's Dome. All that winter, south slopes tended to be corn snow, north slopes, powder snow, and east or west slopes, terrible breakable crust. In 1947, smoking was still cool, an okay thing to do. However, Pop, a lifelong pipe smoker, was the only one foresighted enough to bring tobacco. Here Rick filches some of that tobacco, and not having a pipe, expertly shows how to roll your own, using a piece of notebook paper. We've thought of selling this sequence to the Bull Durham Tobacco Company as an instruction film. Pop has gotten disgusted and left. And the good part is, if this technique doesn't work, and obviously it's not working too well right here, there's always the tasty Copenhagen approach. But in the end, we found that a short length of clothesline works about as well as anything else. Pop spends a day doing laundry, whether it needs it or not. Whoops. No matter how many times I show this sequence, that laundry bowl always slides off the rock. Women, this was totally unexpected. We thought we were alone up there, and we hadn't seen a woman for weeks. Bill, obviously unprepared, does a bit of primping. Back to color. The sunsets seen from the door of the Macaulay cabin were gorgeous. It was hard not to use up all of our precious color film on them. Here we spend a day skiing on the flanks of Johnson Peak, just south of the meadow. Bill and Pop, Bill catching a few rays. What would I have done that winter without Bill for my willing and able subject? It's sobering to recall that just 2 years earlier, he was a soldier engaged in fierce fighting in Western Europe. These are north-facing slopes, hence lovely powder. Those animal tracks in the snow are coyote tracks. We seldom saw a coyote, but they often serenaded us in the evenings. Steve now seems to have control of the tobacco. We're off on another excursion. On this day, we climb up to Bud Lake, nestled in a broad basin between Unicorn and Cathedral Peaks, just a timberline. That's Unicorn there. That's Cathedral. Again, Bill catching a few rays, and Echo Peaks in the background. You have doubtless seen that famous Chaz Adams cartoon of a skier going on both sides of a tree. Well, actually it's easy. Later in the film, we'll explain how it's done. This is Steve on a chute below Echo Peaks. I was never able to persuade Steve to take a fall for the camera. Not surprisingly, Steve became an important figure in the ski industry. For nearly 30 years, he managed Winter Park in Colorado, and during that time pioneered the practice of grooming slopes. A typical lunch, nuts, raisins, and chocolate, and Steve making faces. That's the coxcomb behind Pop there. In this shot, Steve does linked stem turns in order to demonstrate that the so-called dipsy doodle is really the same thing with the inside ski picked up. Here's the Dipsy Doodle. He does make it look easy. And now he does a glorious run down to the forest below. Again, the inevitable sunset scene at the Macaulay cabin. Mount Gibbs in the background. We're off to the third cabin at Tenaya Lake, 9 miles farther west. In 1947, this section of the Tioga Road was, quote unquote, unimproved. A decade later, it was made into a broad highway. Dangerous road, next 21 miles. Drive slowly. Now we reach the Tenaya Lake Ranger cabins. Obviously, one of them is pretty well ventilated. And here, Bill does get a welcome. We are in a country of magnificent granite domes, made famous in part by the Yosemite photographer Ansel Adams. And speaking of Yosemite, there's Half Dome from the east, and Cloud's Rest. Two familiar landmarks of Yosemite Valley. We're now back at Tuolomne. A big snowstorm has just ended, and we are in a winter wonderland as beautiful as any I have ever seen. Cathedral Peak. I promised to explain how to ski on both sides of a tree at the same time. You'll have to watch closely. First you aim for the tree, and then you lean a little bit to the side, well, both sides actually, while you twist your wrists in the opposite direction. And voila, nothing to it. Of course, that doesn't mean Bill is quite caught on yet. So Steve demonstrates in full glorious detail. Oh well, another time perhaps. I climbed up the backside of Lembert's Dome and took a few late afternoon Christmas card shots, like Cathedral Peak, through the trees. A view of the surrounding country, Mount Dana, the Tioga Road and the forest there that we came down, Johnson Peak, Unicorn Cathedral, Tuolomne Meadows, our cabin's down there somewhere. And lovely Christmas tree icicles. The new snow was leaking into our heated cabin, so on this day we did the only honest day's work of the whole trip. We shoveled the snow away from the sides of the cabin. And a few portraits. There's Steve and Bill and Pop. And another sunset, but with a difference. A storm is in the making. We return now to Tioga Camp, our first cabin, where we meet another brother, Dave, and his wife, Lilla. Dave was still in the Army and could get away to join us for only a week. Here they come. They brought news that the Soviet ambassador to the United Nations had said no again, but they also brought mail from home, and in particular, some nice purple perfumed letters to Bill from a certain special someone. Once again, we do a tour into the Connes Lake Saddlebag areas. That's White Mountain. We'll see some good skiing on White Mountain quite shortly. That's Mount Connes. We didn't ski on that, obviously. A blizzard is making up and will catch us shortly here, North Peak, I believe. The blizzard is just hitting. In the height of the storm, I triggered a laboratory-sized wind slab avalanche while skiing along behind our cabin. I didn't figure out what had happened till it was all over. All I knew was that the snow around my feet broke up into cracks, a little tree went past me moving uphill, and then all was quiet. That's the avalanche there. And here Steve is creating avalanches of his own, breaking off snow cornices. But as Bill now demonstrates, sometimes they break off behind you. After the storm abated, we climbed Mount Dana, all of us, including Pop. At over 13,000 feet, it is one of the highest peaks in the park. That's Pop moving along there. The trip was obviously well documented. Dana was very windswept, and for the last half mile or so, we had to abandon skis and climb on foot. Here we are on top, the wind blowing up from the glacier below. Across Owens Valley to the White Mountains, Mono Lake, Mount Connes, looking north along the crest. Being buffeted around by the wind up here quite a bit. Tuolomne Meadows off in the distance. Now we're down a bit, it's quieter. We did not get good skiing on Dana, but the next day we climbed White Mountain near Connes, and there found fabulous skiing. Dave and Lila, behind them the jaws of the Levining Gorge where we came in, the White Mountains in the distance. If this were the Colorado Rockies, we'd be crazy to climb a big open slope that steep. We'd all be carried away in an avalanche. But the mountains of the West Coast are entirely different. The snow comes in wet and heavy and very quickly consolidates to what the natives call Sierra cement. There is no weak layer of hoarfrost in the snowpack. In our experience, the only winter avalanches that occur in the Sierra are at the height of a snowstorm or shortly thereafter. The summit of White Mountain, Mount Lyell, the highest peak in the park, in the distance. Mount Connes. The skiing on the northeast face of White Mountain was truly excellent. So good we climbed back up there a second day. The underlying snow was consolidated and firm, as I mentioned, but with a thin surface layer of powder, almost like the groomed slopes of ski areas 50 years later. There is only one hardship in cross-country skiing. You have to climb uphill under your own power, as Bill demonstrates. That is, unless you are clever. Wonderful skiing, hard-packed with just a layer of powder on the surface. That's Mount Dana, its north side eaten away by the glacier. Dave also took some shots on White Mountain with a camera like mine. He kindly gave me a copy of his footage to add to my own, and so this is it. Some definition was lost in the copying and the color is a little different, but the film has some nice touches, so I'm happy to include it. I'm taking this picture, and that's Dave approaching. The only thing you need to know is right behind me there's a cornice. Dave seems to have survived that. Dave takes some nice backlighting shots here, slow motion. A little light is leaking into the camera, which gives those red flashes. The sun is just over the brow of the hill, so anytime a skier makes a maneuver, you get this plume of white blazing up into the sky. On the second day, we returned to the cabin along the top of the ridge. These scenes remind me of pictures I've seen of skiing in Norway, touring along above timberline over wind-packed snow. Seemingly, we could glide along for miles. It is now time for Dave and Lil and Steve to leave us. I skied down the gorge with them to pick up fresh food, get the mail, and look for more movie film. A heavy wire for conveying snow depth reports to the bottom proves useful for conveying knapsacks. It looks wild, but the knapsacks all arrived at the bottom unscathed. They were waiting for us at the bottom of a catenary curve down there. Pop, Bill, and I have now returned to Tuolomne Meadows for the final weeks of our stay. The only film I could get in Lee Vining was black and white and obviously old and grainy, but I include these pictures because they show spring coming to Tuolomne Meadows. The weather is balmy, thunderheads develop in the afternoons, and a pair of bluebirds arrive at our cabin. One day we ski down beside the Tuolomne River toward Tuolomne Falls and Glen Aulin. A rare fall by Bill. But he goes back and shows how to do it with a flourish along the edge of the stream there. Spring conditions. There's Pop, pretty fit at 69. He would continue cross-country skiing for another dozen years or so before hanging up the boards. That's Glen Aulin. Farther downstream is Hetch Hetchy, a twinned Yosemite Valley which San Francisco dammed and flooded early in the 20th century. That's a lip of Tuolomne Falls there. The river opening up. One of our last tours was a climb to the saddle of the Unicorn. Shown here. That's Elizabeth Lake down there, Lambert's Dome in the distance. Here on the saddle, looking across the way at Echo Peaks and the Coxcomb. Nice picture of the Coxcomb. There's Pop. We had avoided doing this trip earlier, fearing avalanches, but I now think our fears were groundless. But we did some other dumb things. Pop skied off alone down to Tuolomne Meadows, 2 miles away through heavy snow and dense forest, while Bill and I skied over to the other side and went down over there. Here we're looking south over Yosemite Park. And there's Bill skiing along below the Coxcomb with some nice spring thunderclouds building in the background. There's the saddle and the nose of the Unicorn. Finally, we dropped down through wet, heavy snow into the basin near Bud Lake, where we had skied earlier in the winter. Bill didn't have much trouble with that heavy snow, but obviously I'm having trouble with it here. A lovely spot. There's the coxcomb, edge on. I end the film with a color sequence from the same area taken a few weeks earlier. A final portrait of Bill, my patient and obliging subject. Sad to say, 3 years after this trip, he contracted polio and lost the use of one leg. He went on to a distinguished career in geology, and he even learned to ski downhill on one leg without riggers on his ski poles, but he could never again ski cross-country. As Pop knew in 1946, a second opportunity does not always come. Bill wends his way back to the cabin through a lovely open pine fir hemlock forest and a final obligatory sunset.